Hello, everyone from New York. We're very happy to be with you again. We have a fascinating speaker today. We also have a very large group of supporters and followers joining us today. We all know that this is beyond 120 days now since the war began, and tragically, we don't see a light at the end of the tunnel yet in terms of the hostage release and the ultimate situation in Gaza, the situation in Israel's north, the regional tensions that we're seeing. You're seeing the United States and the UK and several other countries that are joining in a de facto coalition, which is becoming clearer and clearer. So to make sense out of all of this, we have an absolute great speaker today. And if I could summarize the situation, I'll take his latest article in the LA Times. This is Matt Levitt, of course, will be introduced in a minute. He wrote an opinion piece that said that the only way to stop Hamas is to stop Iran from rebuilding it. That sounds short and to the point. So without further ado, Daniel, the floor is yours to introduce our speaker and the topic, please.
Thank you, David, and hello, everyone. So indeed, today, we will explore the critical issue of Iran's role as a major state sponsor of terrorism and its impact on the alarming rise of antisemitism, especially in the wake of the tragic events of October 7th. Iran's terrorist tentacles have their involvement in destabilizing every border of Israel and in different but as threatening ways on the European continent as well. From Lebanon's Hezbollah to Yemen's Houthis, all the way deep into Gaza and several organizations there, and to several terror attacks plotted and some even successfully executed on European soil. So to unravel the complexities of Hamas's financing network and dissect Iran's support for terrorism, we have with us today Dr. Matthew Levitt, the director of the Counterterrorism and Intelligence Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Previously, Levitt served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And in the past, he was an FBI counterterrorism analyst, which included working on the Millennial and September 11 plots. He also served as a State Department counterterrorism advisor for General James L. Jones, the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security. So first, Matthew, thank you very much for being here today with us to discuss this very easy and light topic that we have. So let me first ask you more of a general question before we dive into the details. In your view, how has Iran's support for terrorism influenced the rise of anti-Semitism, especially in the Islamist world?
So, Daniel, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be speaking for ELNET again. You guys do really important work, and so it's a real pleasure to be able to play a small part in it. Thanks for including me. Look, Iran is a strange regime. It is an ideologically driven, theologically driven regime, which from its outset, from day one in 1979, structured itself such that the revolution would never end at its borders. So this effort to export the revolution got interrupted by the Iran-Iraq War. But I think most people forget that, in 1979, 80, 81, 82, Iran had created agencies and departments of the government whose sole purpose was to export the revolution. And of course, they started in countries in the Middle East, where there were sizable Shia minorities, and elsewhere in both Europe and the Americas as well. To that end, Iran is dead set against the existence of the State of Israel. It's not a problem of a two-state solution or a lack of a two-state solution. It's not a question of occupation. It's a question of Israel's existence. And Iran's position on this is fundamentally anti-Semitic. There will be plenty of times when they will say, no, we're not against Jews, we're just against Zionists. But then they slip just as often as they stick to the party line and admit that really their problem is about Jews worldwide. And you can see this, by the way, in terms of their external operations. So I have a project going on right now, literally mapping Iran's external assassination plots, its abduction plots, etc., around the world. These have been going on since 1979 and have really picked up pace in the past decade. I think most people are aware that Iran has tried to assassinate senior American leaders in the wake of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. I think many people are aware that Iran has tried to assassinate and kidnap Iranian dissidents around the world. I don't think as many people are aware how often Iran has tried to assassinate Israelis or separately assassinate Jews who are not Israelis. This project is going to result in a map that we're going to be releasing in a few weeks, but just to give you a taste, since 1979, I've tracked, and this is just a fraction of what we can talk about publicly in the public domain, 48 incidents when Iran has tried to kill Israelis abroad, 48, 33 of which are in the past decade. And 16 instances where Iran has targeted Jews, 9 in just the past decade. And this is all separate from the many things that Iran does to support, train, arm, provide intelligence and funding and direction for proxy groups along a very wide, long spectrum that may not share a whole lot in common with Iran, except for their antipathy for Israel first and the United States and the West second. So put the Houthis in Yemen at one far end of the spectrum, who honestly are a different type of Shia than the Iranians are, don't much like each other, but find in each other really useful alliances. The Houthis are an exceptionally easy, inexpensive, and risk-free way for the Iranians to stick it to the Saudis, to stick it to the Emiratis, and now most recently to stick it to Israel and the West in terms of the maritime coalition. And then at the far other end of the spectrum, you have Lebanese Hezbollah, which is the first among equals in Iran's proxy networks, and effectively today is part of the Quds Force. All of these Iran uses to target Israel in a variety of ways, and that's never been clear in the period we've seen since October 7th.
So in that aspect, if we look more particularly in since October 7th, but even in the weeks before, some reports suggested that Iran was not fully aware or fully involved in these attacks, and what led to Hezbollah then joining the party, if I may say so. So given your expertise in the matter, how would you assess the complexity of Hamas's financing network? Because the money came from somewhere and the plans were prepared somewhere. But if Iran wasn't directly involved, how was that happening?
Let's take these in two separate parts. First, the issue of was Iran aware, and does that matter? And the second, the issue of Hamas financing, which of course are very much interrelated. The assessment of the US and other intelligence communities is that the Iranians woke up on October 7th and were surprised that this was happening that morning. For that matter, the belief of intelligence services in the United States and in Israel too, and for that matter in Gulf states, I should say, since October 7th, I've been to Israel twice. I just came back the other day. I've also been to Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and to Europe. Everybody's pretty much in agreement over the assessment that even Hamas, the vast majority of Hamas people, the leadership in Doha, for example, woke up on October 7th and said, oh, what's happening now? Some of them probably didn't know about this plan at all. Many of them knew of something, but didn't know when it was going to happen. When it comes to Iran, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, I thought put it well when he said, look, at the end of the day, it doesn't make a difference if the Iranians said, now send 10 people to Kfar Aza and then send 20 people to, Zakim Beach, or they just trained and armed and radicalized and pushed Hamas along with others proxies to do whatever they could to target Israel. You can't wind up that toy, point it in the direction of Israel, and then be surprised when it goes in that direction. Right? Iran is ultimately, fundamentally responsible for creating the monster that is Hamas. And again, I think it's critically important to stress Hamas didn't do what it did because of occupation. Hamas didn't do what it did because of a lack of a two-state solution. It's quite the opposite. Hamas did what it did because it got very, very scared about the prospects of normalization with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were asking things of the Israelis that would have moved in the direction of some type of Palestinian statehood. And that scared Hamas because that is exactly what they don't want. Hamas doesn't want just any Palestinian state. It wants an Islamist Palestinian state, not a secular one, in all of what it considers historic Palestine. To that end, it is as much an enemy of secular Palestinians as it is of Israel. So on the first question, Iran was ultimately responsible. I think it's important to remember that for at least 2 years, the Quds Force and Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad were all holding regular meetings in Beirut in what they call the Joint Operations Room, their term, not mine, for at least 2 years. And finally, the plot that Hamas carried out on October 7th, shoot lots of rockets over the border, then have people infiltrate across the border, kill as many people as possible, take as many people hostage, take as many bodies of dead people back. This was not originally Hamas's plan. This was the Hezbollah plan. I've been going up to the northern border in Israel, border with Lebanon, for many, many years now, at least once a year. And for many years now, this plot is exactly the plot that Israel's Northern Command has been training and training and training to thwart, expecting it to come from Hezbollah. So it's not like people didn't know anything. As for Hamas financing, it's really interesting because there are two big changes that happened. One in 2007, and the second just now on October 7th, 2023. 2007, the big change was that Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force of arms. Not from Israel, mind you. The Israelis had withdrawn all settlers, all military to the last person in 2005. And the only reason there was still any type of a siege is because Hamas was in charge and was openly committed to Israel's destruction. So the Israelis were trying to prevent things from getting in that could do something like what ultimately happened on October 7th.
Right.
By virtue of controlling territory, they made a lot of money, a tremendous amount of money over time, ultimately getting somewhere between 350 and 500 million a year. There were other ways of making money as well, but the second kind of consistent set of funds came from Iran. And so in recent years, that has become as much as $100 or $120 million a year less than they were making from controlling the Gaza Strip. But the majority of the money from Iran was earmarked for the military. And so in terms of what leads to an October 7th, as opposed to what funds garbage collection and paying teacher salaries, the money from Hamas was operational funds.
So, and if I make the parallel, and I believe you've written about it yourself, Israel's government and also military has repeatedly said that the objective right now of the war in Gaza is to dismantle Hamas, to destroy Hamas, to eradicate it. Choose the word you want, if it's a military one or more of a policy-oriented. But can it be done if we don't cut out these sort of financing? And what I was alluding to about the thing you wrote is we saw this in 2006 with Hezbollah. There was a second Lebanon war, which was very destructive for Lebanon. Hezbollah, there's always this famous quote, everybody says that Nasrallah, if he had known, he wouldn't have done what he had done, if he had seen the destruction that was coming towards him. But this is what Gaza is going through now. So is the destruction of Hamas basically impossible?
Okay, so first, I've been telling any Israeli and anybody else who will listen, as a friend, stop talking about destroying Hamas. Nobody has ever destroyed a terrorist group by military means alone. We did not destroy the Islamic State for all the international coalition did targeting Islamic State. We destroyed their governance project. We inflicted territorial defeat, and they are now no longer a statelet with big capabilities, but they are terrorist groups all over the place. That's got to be the goal here with Hamas. There will still be individual Hamas people in Gaza. There will certainly be in the West Bank and in Lebanon, etc. That's for another time. The goal here is to destroy Hamas's governance project in the Gaza Strip, to destroy its safe haven, to dismantle its military industrial complex, where they've built over 17 years the ability to literally have their own labs to build their own bullets, their own guns, their own rockets. All of that makes Hamas capable of something like October 7th. The goal here is to dismantle that so they don't have this massive safe haven and infrastructure. That is possible. But because there will still be Hamas people in the Gaza Strip, because it's not entirely clear that you will always be able to find your Yahya Sinwar, your Mohammed Deifs, your Marwan Isas. It took us a long time, even in a small geographic space, to find bin Laden, to find Zawahiri, etc. We have to anticipate that as the dust settles, the international community is going to try and rebuild the Gaza Strip, not just physically, but build some other type of political system there. We have to assume that Iran is also going to try and rebuild its proxy. If not with this massive infrastructure, then to build it back to the terrorist insurgent group that it was before 2007. And we have to be thinking about that in advance. And the two main things that my colleague Mike Singh and I argued in this LA Times piece that you're referring to is thinking proactively about the ways in which Iran moves money and moves weapons to Hamas. I think one problem that the Israelis had over time, and it's a little bit of hubris, is that as they built the fence, and then as they built the underground fence to stop tunnels, the assumption was that Hamas wouldn't be able to get through this fence. And so therefore, it's just a question of strategic rockets. And that's what they began focusing on. They weren't as focused on stopping your RPGs and your AK-47s. And it's also the case that some of these got through a long, long time ago. I've toured a display of some of the weapons seized on October 7th at an Israeli military base, and a significant portion of those weapons are older weapons, still very functional and deadly, but older weapons. We need to be thinking about maritime interdiction. Hopefully this effort that has been put together with some 20 countries dealing with the Houthis will be able to be continued in an effort to make it more difficult for Iran to move weapons through this region. That's not a guarantee. Not all 20 of those countries are willing to go on record publicly as saying they're here even to deal with the Houthi threat, which is undermining international maritime safety and shipping. So they're probably not going to be so willing, at least not publicly, to do that vis-a-vis Iran after. But we need to be thinking about that in a much more holistic way. And the second is the money for Hamas coming from Iran. You know, Iran has this ability to put money on planes and fly it to Syria and then drive it into Lebanon. When it comes to Hezbollah, there are fewer tools at our disposal, but that money goes into Lebanon and is then sent into Gaza for Hamas through money exchange houses and hawalas. And there are things that we can and should be doing more and better when it comes to those. I think that one of the things that the Israelis have successfully done is target that financial infrastructure in Gaza. Just the other day, they found a huge cash, collection of literally cash in one of the tunnels. They've targeted Hamas's formal and informal banking institutions. The U.S. Treasury has designated an entity through which you could cash out your cryptocurrency in the Gaza Strip. So I think that when the dust settles, it's going to be much harder for Hamas to get money in, but it's not going to be impossible. And Iran will be dedicated to rebuilding Hamas in ways that we in the West have not always been equally dedicated. If you look at Syria, Iran was just simply much more committed to supporting the Assad regime than we in the international community were in supporting the moderate rebels. And so what we don't want is to see something in Gaza play out like it did in Syria.
So lot to unpack here. So as we are blessed with threats from all around, let's before we move north in Gaza, you've mentioned the Houthis and you've mentioned all of the maritime situation and countries that are willing or aren't willing to help this to combat this threat, basically. Have you identified any possibility and a chance? Because you've mentioned earlier the normalization, and obviously Hamas came here to torpedo everything that is positive that has been going on in the region. But there is some sort of an opening towards a plan of the day after. And don't you think, and have you seen any possibility where the Arab countries neighboring, because obviously the Houthis are a big problem for the Egyptians in the Suez Canal, but also for the West. And Hamas is also a big threat for the region in general. Saudis aren't a big fan, to say the least. So wouldn't the normalization process or the Abraham Accords or any coalition in the Red Sea might actually be stronger now since the domino has fallen?
So we have two competing phenomenon happening here. On the one hand, and as I've said, I've been in the Gulf pretty extensively over the past few weeks. On the one hand, there really is a sense quietly away from the cameras that says, look, if little Hamas, which I describe as the runt of the Iran threat network, what are the least capable of Iran's major proxies, if Hamas, little Hamas, can bring the region to what will hopefully only be the brink of regional war, then imagine what Lebanese Hezbollah or the Al-Shabi, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, etc., others could do. If you are sitting in the Gulf, I believe that Gulf states look at this and say, no, like ultimately, strategically, normalization is more important. And I think that Saudis in particular, not yet being part of the Abraham Accords, I think they really started paying more attention and started thinking pragmatically about moving forward on some type of normalization with Israel under certain types of conditions, not because they looked at all the Israeli tourists going to the UAE and said, oh, we want that, but because they looked at, you can't go to the UAE now without bumping into Israelis left and right, but because...
I'm sure they're thriving.
I can tell you stories another time, but what they really are kind of jealous about is two things that moved much more quickly, I think, than anybody anticipated, and that is Israeli Emirati cyber defense and missile defense. And the idea of having a kind of shared regional aerial defense system, given the behavior that Iran itself and its proxies have demonstrated over and over again over the past few years, is something that the Saudis and others would very much like to be a part of. On the other hand, and that is real, that is tangible, but it's also not the only thing that's happening here. On the other hand, there are two very real phenomena. One is people are tremendously distraught over the number of people killed in the Gaza Strip and the images they're seeing. And I'm distraught too. War is a horrible thing, a horrible thing. I do believe that the Israelis do more than anybody else to try and minimize those casualties. And the fact that you still have the kind of casualties you do just tells you all you need to know, A, about war, and B, about the way that Hamas not only invested in efforts to protect them, the fighters, and not the population. Hamas has never built a bomb shelter for anybody. Hamas leaders have come out very publicly and said, our job is to prepare to fight Israel. The UN or somebody else should protect. That's the kind of leadership we're talking about here. But more than that, Hamas leaders have come out publicly and said, we need the blood of Palestinians to get the international community on our side. That's the kind of twisted and disgusting logic that we're dealing with here. And on top of that, because of the nature of Israeli domestic politics, which were complicated to say the least before October 7th, and have been kind of put on a little bit of a pause until recently because of October 7th, it's also been difficult for Israel to be really clear on not what it's against, but what it could be for or could tolerate in terms of the day after. And that makes it uncomfortable, not only for Western, US, European countries, but also for the Gulf countries. And so at one point, a senior Israeli official said, well, don't worry about it. The Emiratis will pay for everything. And I can tell you they were none too pleased with that, because it's not the case that under any circumstance, no matter what, the Gulf states are going to foot the bill. There will be an interest in doing what can be done, but only if there is a clear, articulated goal for what comes after. And I think that has yet to happen.
At ELNET, and to potentially make the bridge to go north with that, we've tried to bring the Europeans more on board with normalization before the war, and today we're seeing that there is more involvement in Europe. Also, we've seen the US-UK relationship, Germany siding a lot very strongly with Israel, and the coalition against the Houthis in the Red Sea. Isn't that now the momentum where you're saying that there a problem to finding on the day after who's going to pay for it. But if there's a coalition of these kind of countries, if we bring the Europeans on board, what their role can be to, first of all, pressure all the actors involved to not escalate more, and that's where I'm alluding to the North, but also to draft a plan for the day after. We've seen the Saudis trying to talk about a future PA, at least behind closed doors and reports we've been hearing. But how can Europeans now come to the table and say, okay, we weren't hearing the normalization at the beginning, but we want a piece of the cake, but also, like you've mentioned, aerial defense, and Europe has its own threats. How can all of this come towards a positive agenda? That's where I'm getting.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work being done in this space. So a week and a half ago, I was sitting in a major European country's foreign ministry with their Middle East team on this and related issues. That country in particular is aggressively, in a very good way, trying to move the ball forward, both in terms of moving towards a day after in Gaza, trying to resolve the painful and just criminal situation of the hostages. This country has several people who were taken hostage. Most Western countries do. I think a lot of people, kind of missed the fact that 40 countries were affected by October 7th after 9/11. This was, I think, the most significant act of international terror, one of the most significant acts of international terrorism targeting Americans in history. And also, this country is very active in terms of trying to help move a diplomatic process forward in the north, that is to say, diplomatically, to communicate to Hezbollah the need to redeploy its forces from the blue line. Publicly, Israel is appropriately talking about redeploying to the Litani River, which is what's required of Hezbollah under UN Security Council Resolution 1701, and which Hezbollah has been blatantly flaunting and in violation of for many years now. Away from the cameras, the Israeli and frankly European and American position is not 1701. It's 10 kilometers. And 10 kilometers is not some random made-up number. The overwhelming majority of the daily firing by Hezbollah from Lebanon into Israel is being carried out by the newer version of the Cornet anti-tank guided missile. And the newer version of the Cornet has a maximum range of about 9 to 10 kilometers. So not the most recent trip, but 2 trips ago to Israel, which was also after October 7th, I met with a very senior Israeli official who had just gone up north the day before with a delegation led by the defense minister to meet with Israeli mayors and heads of regional councils in this swath of territory that has been forced to evacuate because of Hezbollah daily attacks. And they asked the leaders of these communities, what would you need for people to be able to go back home? There's tremendous political and social and economic pressure to enable people to be able to go back home to the north. It's not like in the south where their communities were decimated and there's that incredible trauma from this insane, inconceivable massacre that happened. And the answer they got was, we don't want to see Hezbollah across the border anymore. We don't want to see them walking around in plain clothes, in uniforms, with guns, with flags. We don't want them shooting lasers like a laser pointer into our houses just across the border at night to taunt us. We don't want to hear digging at night, and we don't want them to be in a range to be able to fire at us, not with small weapons and not with anti-tank guided missiles. That amounts to 10 kilometers. Now, Hezbollah is not just going to do that and say, we give in. And so 2 things are happening. One is Hezbollah is saying they won't stop everything until things in the south stop. It's not clear if it's fully stop or what type of situation. And meanwhile, the United States with Amos Hochstein, several European countries, others are meeting with Hezbollah on a regular basis. French officials, UK officials, German officials, all in the past week, communicating to Hezbollah, you need to understand, remember, as you said, Daniel, in 2006, when Nasrallah said, mea culpa, if I only knew what those Israelis would do, you need to understand, it's getting to that point. And you're either going to redeploy 10 kilometers or the Israelis are going to redeploy you. And the bottom line is, when Hezbollah fires daily and the Israelis fire back, they're not just firing back at the point of initiation, the point where the Hezbollah shot from. All of the Hezbollah infrastructure right along the blue line, all of the pillboxes and the observation points, the Green Without Borders facilities. Remember, we were talking before October 7th about tents. Tents are gone. All of this is gone, right? Effectively, there's already of unknown depth, a space that the Israelis have basically cleansed of most of the Hezbollah infrastructure. You won't cleanse it of every Hezbollah operative, because many of these people are people who live in the south. But the time, when Hezbollah would come to you and say, listen, you have an extra bedroom, we're going to put some rockets there, and you think that bedroom won't get hit, that's past. Everybody hopes, I really hope, that Hezbollah gets the message, because Israel's getting to a point where it's not going to be able to tolerate this anymore. Because if they don't, the prospect of an Israel-Hezbollah war, should it become a full-fledged war, is a very, very serious thing. It's very serious for Lebanon. And if Hezbollah had any doubt of Israel's seriousness, a few weeks ago, before October 7th, there was this kind of infantile Hezbollah Israeli back and forth. No, we're going to send you back to the Stone Age. No, we're going to send you back to the Stone Age. If Hezbollah had any doubt, they look at northern Gaza, they see the Israelis are serious. You like it, you don't like it, they're serious. But so is Hezbollah. They don't want to spend these rockets right now. Iran doesn't want them to spend these rockets right now. The precision-guided missiles, Iran sees those as its protector, preventing Israel or other countries from targeting their nuclear program, which, by the way, has been progressing since October 7th.
Right.
And they see the missiles, if anybody were to attack the nuclear program, as the second strike capability. They don't really want these used in the moment. But if Hezbollah does use some or all of them, not all, some, we're talking about thousands of casualties. We're talking about a water crisis. We're talking about an energy crisis. It would be a war like Israel hasn't seen.
So in that aspect, and in your point, so there's a few things here, because there's a few people that are saying that we're about to see a hostage deal, whether today or in a few weeks or whatnot. If it happens, it means a very long ceasefire in the south. Is that the moment where our eyes should turn to the north and realize that it's about to happen there? Or will it go ahead if you want to? I saw you started to.
The hope, right? The hope is, and this is one of the reasons why this is attractive to Israel, even though having to kind of stop the serious level of taking the fight to Hamas in the moment is not what they would otherwise want militarily. But there are two factors that are exceptionally important to Israel. One is the hostages. Stop, just the hostages. The second is the opportunity to have a pause long enough to give Hezbollah, frankly, the face-saving opportunity to say, okay, our daily barrage on Israel helped. It drew forces away from Hamas. It put pressure on them, in large part because of this. People like Matt Levitt and others have said that this and we've done our thing, and now we can calm down. And that will give an opportunity for things to calm. Now, that would also end up putting de facto pressure on Israel in terms of what it can resume doing afterwards, because it would have to assume or fear or be concerned that if it ratcheted things back up in Gaza, Hezbollah could resume again. And so there'd be a new phase in that northern deterrence. It wouldn't be the end of it. And large part would depend on in what way the IDF continues to take the fight to Hamas at the end of whatever this 6, 8, whatever week pause could be.
So before I turn to Q&A, I'll ask you one last question regarding that. So then if we're all in the tit for tat and the deterrence kind of chess game, we're also seeing the escalation between Iran's either forces or proxies against American forces in the Middle East. Where will Iran continue to push, even through a ceasefire, where they would know that the US will also be deterred because they won't want Hezbollah and Israel to escalate either? Where is this going to continue? Are the Iranians, to your opinion, expected to continue to push red line of both Israel and the West, or the West in particular?
Didn't you hear the Iranians say they have nothing to do with these attacks on U.S. forces? Daniel, what are you talking about?
Right.
Again, the whole strategy is you create these proxies, you arm these proxies, you train them, and then you're able to do things with what they would consider reasonable deniability. Look, Iranian proxies carried out about 170 strikes on U.S. interests in Iraq and Syria, and they didn't get a whole lot of a response. Then they carried out another strike and killed three Americans, and now they're beginning to get a little bit of a response. Now the response is still in Syria and Iraq, targeting mostly their proxies. And there's a big school of thought that says, look, you don't want to start a whole new war, but ultimately Iran is willing to fight to the last Arab. Meaning, if the strikes against Iran are just strikes against its proxies, the Iranians will be happy with that all day long. There's a school of thought that says something needs to be hit in Iran in the middle of the night, very few casualties, whatever, but to give a signal. The other argument is this could work if what happens, which is what the Pentagon is saying is going to happen, if it's a rolling response. So it's not one strike, it's not two strikes, but it's going to be a rolling response over time. I think that the U.S. now has gotten to the point of understanding that there needs to be a little bit of a pushback on Iran so that it understands that this has gone too far. And I think the idea here is a rolling pushback on Iranian proxy so that Iran understands that if it continues the next phase, like we're doing a pretty big thing here for us, the next thing is not going to be in Iraq or in Syria. That's my takeaway. So the question isn't so much kind of what does the U.S. do? I can't tell you how many media interviews I've done where people have said, the Americans are escalating. The Israelis are escalating. I keep reminding people, like Israel, the United States, the Western Coalition, the Maritime Coalition, none of us are escalating. We're responding to a massive escalation by Iran and its proxies. And we're finally saying, whoa, that's enough. Trying to protect maritime shipping is not an escalation. Responding when there are 170 attacks on your forces is not escalation. And I think that's why part of the message right now, both in terms of these strikes and in terms of some backroom messaging, is don't push too hard. And at the end of the day, I think, everybody, including the Iranians, are worried things get out of hand and become something much, much bigger. They're happy, the Iranians and Hezbollah in particular, with the level of this. I mean, Hezbollah for a long time has been trying to resurrect its quote-unquote resistance credentials after having fought in Syria all these years. And Nasrallah famously said, the road to Jerusalem goes to Damascus, which just means he was never good at geography, because there's no way it does, not geographically or otherwise. So they're very happy kind of being able to reassert their we fight Israel, but they don't want it to go too far. And so ultimately, I think even they, Iran, Hezbollah, Houthis, and the Iraqi Shia militias too, are going to be kind of taking a sigh of relief if there's an opportunity to kind of scale things back a little bit and be able to look at this and say, look what we did. We have tested, we have implemented Qasem Soleimani's plan of uniting the fronts. And this is now what the rest of us need to understand will be the new normal. And how we deal with that will be the challenge moving forward.
Do you think Nasrallah will always abide by what Tehran is telling him to do?
It's not that simple. Nasrallah in particular, because of his unique position, it's not like Iran says jump and they say how high, unless it's the office of the supreme leader. And then that's it. We believe that when the Quds Force first came to Hezbollah and said, you should get involved in the war in Syria, Nasrallah said, that's not such a great idea. A couple of weeks later, they sent someone from the office of the supreme leader, and basically Nasrallah said, why didn't you say so? That's it, we're in. And we're in, full force. I do think that going forward, the axis of resistance, the Iran threat network, as we call it here in the US, will want to be able to demonstrate interoperability. And if one is attacked, all respond in some way. Not necessarily for as long as we've seen this war go on, but this, I believe, they want to be the new normal. This was Qasem Soleimani's big innovation that he was not yet able to put into place because he was taken out of commission.
Turning now to Q&A, I'd like to, for the first question, group two questions that we've received from Berzad Kianmad, apologies if I mispronounce your name, and Zori Mizrahi, about the regime in Iran. Both questions allude to the potential of the regime to collapse or the uprising within Tehran, and what is Israel or US doing or not doing, ignoring them, these uprisings and these calls for regime change?
Look, this has always been a very, very sensitive and complicated matter, right? And so long as this regime is in place, this type of behavior, whether it's against Israel, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's malign activity in the region, whether it's the horrendous suppression of Iranians themselves, is going to continue. Because at the end of the day, the regime comes down to two things: maintaining the revolution and exporting the revolution, survival and exporting the revolution. There is such a thing, however, as giving too much of a Western public bear hug and providing the regime with the ability to say, you see, all these things are only happening because everybody's against us. So everyone has always been trying to figure out what's the best way to do what we can and to do it quietly, maybe do certain things publicly. And I don't think anybody's found the right answer. And I think that it's not necessarily the case that if the international community, for example, were to carry out a strike on Iranian territory in response to what Iran is doing in the region, that would necessarily help Iranians on the ground who are trying to replace the regime. I think it would provide an opportunity for the regime to circle the wagons. You'd have a lot of people who would, the Iranians are very proud to circle the wagons from a foreign attack. At the end of the day, I don't see this regime as being able to survive, because at the end of the day, there's this massive delta, there's this massive disconnect between the radical ideological theologians who are running the government and the population, which is increasingly young and increasingly not fundamentalist. And so I don't think that this is something that's going to be changed from the outside, but I think it's an excellent question to which I don't have a really good substantive answer about how to better support those who are trying to promote democracy within Iran.
For the next question, I'd like to turn to Eli Aliashmerni, please, if you'd like to ask a question. And again, apologies if I mispronounced the last.
You did just fine, thank you. The question that I have is about, what do you make of the fact that England and the United States are now talking about recognizing a Palestinian state?
So I think that there's a lot of talk in the region now about trying to figure out what comes after, what the day after can be. And there is general consensus outside of Israel that what has to come after has to be some type of Palestinian self-governance, self-rule. You don't want to step back from that in the Gaza Strip. Now, most people in Israel feel that's kind of crazy. I think they feel like, what doesn't the world understand about the fact that it was the most pro-peace, the left, that was literally murdered and massacred in the South? What do they not understand about what October 7th shows about whether it should have been or not, what has in fact happened each time Israel has withdrawn from territory? Like, it just comes out of a vacuum for most Israelis. It doesn't take into account or appreciate the level of trauma and complete lack of trust. I mean, for example, Israel used to allow all these Palestinian workers into Israel on a daily basis to work. Many of those people who worked in these communities in the South were forced by Hamas to give them information, which is how Hamas got all the granular information, extremely detailed information, to be able to carry out the October 7th plots. Because of that, you're not going to have an Israel going forward that's going to be willing to have anywhere near that many Palestinians come through. You're going to have Indians and people from Central Asia and Sri Lankans. They're already coming in to replace them. It's going to be a different scenario. I think what you're seeing among Western leaders is this talk of, what can we do to try and bridge that gap? So if we acknowledge some type of Palestinian entity, maybe we can move towards it. I think that's their idea. That's not my idea. That's their idea. I think we need to have a very serious conversation about what can happen in Gaza, and I think we just need to be honest with ourselves. That's very, very difficult to do with the Israeli government right now because of the nature of Israeli politics right now, and that's proving to be really, really complicated, and it could create some real tension between European powers and the United States on the one hand, and Israel on the other, even given the intimacy of that relationship with Israel. And so I think what you're seeing is Western powers trying to find a way to bridge that gap. Because at the end of the day, this is boomeranging on Western leaders politically. It's boomeranging on President Biden as he goes into a presidential election cycle. Without Michigan, Biden loses. Okay, that President Biden went to Michigan the other day, did not meet with anybody in the Arab American community, right? Just didn't feel that would go well in the moment. How can you bridge that? How can you, this is something I think they're trying to navigate. I think that conversation is part of this effort.
But isn't it obvious to them that no one is actually asking for that because the Palestinians don't want a state next to Israel, as you mentioned, and Israelis for sure at this point don't see that. So there must be something else going on. Why are these two countries talking about this at this point? Thank you, and I'll stop.
Yeah, no, first of all, I disagree with the premise that no Palestinians want a two-state solution. I think the overwhelming majority do, as someone who goes and meets with them. And I think it's worth remembering that while the reality is very different now on February 5th, with 3 months of war, our think tank, I wasn't involved in it, but our think tank published a poll in July, which found that over 70% of Gazans were sick and tired of Hamas, did not support Hamas targeting Israel, wanted Hamas disarmed, though they weren't going to do it themselves, and were so desperate that they even wanted the PA to come back into Gaza, despite the fact that no one had, kind of fuzzy, warm feelings or forgot about the corruption or ineptitude of the Palestinian Authority. You poll people right now, it'll be a very, very different poll because bombs have been dropping on their head. If bombs were dropping on my head, whoever was doing it under whatever circumstance, I'd be uptight and angry too. But I do think that at the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians are not supportive of Hamas's idea of destroying Israel. They do want their own state. And at some point, that's a conversation we're going to need to have.
For the sake of, there was a poll, it was published quite recently from a Palestinian pollster, I believe, quite a few weeks ago, and it didn't show quite positive numbers. Let's move on to Susan Aziade, please.
Hi, my question is, thank you. I actually typed in my question, but why would United States give notice to Iran about the places that they are going to strike in Iraq and other countries? Why would they give them notice so they can take away everything that's there, that's important to United States?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the United States didn't tell them everywhere they were going to attack, but they did pretty much close, right? They made it very, very clear that they were going to attack. They pretty much made it clear they were going to be attacking in Iraq. And in Syria, they were not very quiet about the B-1 bombers, leaving the United States. They certainly kind of indicated to the Iranians, something's coming. Not the way I would have done it. I think probably it was an effort to try and de-escalate things. I think that probably the United States wanted Iranians to get out. Again, not my assessment, but probably the Pentagon's assessment that better not to hit Iranians, and that if you did this and you did it in a rolling fashion, which appears to be what the plan is, it would send a message. It would not only deter the capabilities of some of these Iranian proxies in Iraq in particular, Syria too, but Iraq in particular, would be send a very, very clear message to Iran that, you know, really, this is enough. We have responded. We've tried to respond in a very, very reserved way. We've tried not to kill your people, with the message being kind of, and that stops here. And, you know, take the message, or the next step will be clear. I kind of rolled my eyes at some of this as well.
Thank you. May I know, is the United States afraid of Iran?
No, the United States is not afraid of Iran, but the United States is afraid of what Iran can do in the region. And you know, the United States is much stronger than Iran. The Secretary of Defense kind of basically put it this way himself. He said, look, Iran has tremendous capabilities, long dramatic pause. I have more. But we also don't want to get into another big regional war. And, you know, just because you have the capabilities doesn't mean you want to be able to, you want to have to deploy them at any time. The bottom line is Iran does not present an existential threat to the United States, and the United States wants to be able to put a lot more resources dealing with China and Russia in particular. We're worried about potential military hostilities in Asia, perhaps over Taiwan, etc. We don't want to get bogged down in something else. How you navigate that is a complicated answer.
Thank you. For our next question, Jean-Louis Velez, please.
Thank you very much. You mentioned earlier that the younger generation in Iran are more secular and not supportive of the regime. Under what scenario could regime change? How could that happen in practice?
Yeah, it's an excellent question to which I don't have the answer because I'm not an Iran domestic expert. I'll be the last guy in Washington, D.C. who will actually tell you where his expertise ends, which is not how things typically operate here. I think you're going to likely get to a situation where the demographics and the economics just no longer work in the favor of the Ayatollahs and their ability to crack down, you know, drawing blood on their own people. I think there's going to be a tipping point. When that happens, what the tipping point is, what things, that I can't tell you. This is beyond my expertise. You want to have an ELNET event with someone who's an expert on domestic Iranian issues. But I do think that, you know, that is something that the Iranians are very, very worried about. I believe that the supreme leader of Iran, who's the second supreme leader, is worried that the first supreme leader, his predecessor, will go down in his history as the man who brought the revolution. He does not want to go down in history as the man who lost the revolution. And so you see this consolidation within the Iranian leadership of people who are current or former members of the IRGC and the Quds Force, and you know, narrowing of that so that it's all about preserving the revolution. And as part of an effort to do that, not just defensively, but offensively, exporting the revolution as well.
Thank you. For our next question, I'd like to turn to Stuart Sloan, please, and thank you for your patience.
Yes, since you've had lots of experience with sanctions, that's where my question is. I'm asking you about the effectiveness or lack thereof of sanctions on Iran, and particularly those with respect to Iran's oil exports. Were they ever effective? Did this administration relax them with respect to China? Is there any chance that the sanctions could be enforced to reduce the amount of exports to China?
Stuart, that's like 4 lectures you just asked about. All excellent questions, but I'm going to try and do this standing on one foot. The bottom line is there still are tremendous, overwhelming sanctions on Iran. It's a question of enforcement, and it's a question not just of kind of weakness, and because you're weak, you're not enforcing. There's a balancing here. We have lots of things on the agenda with China. We have lots of things on the agenda with other countries that are working with us on issues, but really want cheap energy and are willing to buy heavily discounted Iranian oil. And so there's a balancing act here, right? How much can you do? How much do you want to do? If you do certain things, it'll hurt Iran, but it'll also hurt others who will then take it out on you in other ways. You know, if you are a China person today, is it more important to you to crack, if you're an American official working on China, is it more important to you to strongly enforce sanctions on Iran and deny China the ability to get cheap oil, or is it more important to get China's cooperation in the fentanyl crisis that is killing thousands of Americans, you know, very regular? There's all kinds of issues like this out there, and the world is not a simple, you know, Iran's doing bad things, it's paying for that with oil, let's just decimate their oil capabilities. It affects lots of other policy options. I do think we need to do a lot more on the enforcement. You've seen recently a bunch of Treasury actions moving in that direction, including not just oil, by the way, but other things too. Iran has been trying to access dollars through the Iraqi banking system. We, together with the Iraqi government, despite the fact that this Iraqi government is very close to the Shia militias, they're sensitive to things happening within and targeting their financial system because they're so reliant on the US dollar and Iraqi funds in the US Federal Reserve. They've been doing things, we've been doing things targeting Iran's financing of Hezbollah and the Assad regime in Syria and Hamas and others through the sale of illicit oil. There's a lot of things going on here, and I think we are at a little bit of a precipice with a shift towards more enforcement, but it is always going to be a balancing game.
Thank you. And so now I think for our last questions and closing remarks, I believe I'll turn to Larry Hochberg, the co-founder of ELNET.
Sure. You mentioned about the Saudis' involvement. The Saudis have a rapprochement of some sort, exchanging full diplomatic relations with Iran. How does that play into all this? Is that a game, or have they given up on trying to confront Iran or not? That's my question. And after you answer that, then I'll close.
So look, it's a very American or Western way of doing things that's either or. And it's a very Oriental way of doing things to do this and. If you are the Gulf states, let me put you this way. When I was in government and was working with Gulf states on Iran sanctions issues, and let's say around 2006, and I would go and meet with officials, we'd meet in their offices, which all had these huge floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the Gulf, and I'd make my pitch, and they'd say, look, Dr. Levitt, you're going to get on an airplane this afternoon or tomorrow and fly home to America, and they'd point out the window behind them, but Iran is never going away, right? So they are going to do multiple things. So they are going to normalize relations, and they will meet nicely, and they'll say nice things, and they will also do other things in an effort to try and kind of convince the Iranians not to be so aggressive against them, even as they know that at some point they will, and they need to do things to prepare for that. Like I said to the previous, in response to the previous question, there's a balance of all kinds of things. And part of that balance is that nowadays, Gulf states increasingly, they still want us, the United States in particular, but the West, the US and Europe in particular, more broadly, to be the backbone of their security relationship. They increasingly are very open about how they're looking to China as the backbone of their economic relationship. And that will sometimes have security implications. If you open your 5G network to Huawei, there's all kinds of security things we in the United States simply are not able to do with you anymore. That's done. That's done. So they're gonna do lots of different things at the same time. And to a Western perspective, sometimes those things are going to seem to be in conflict. From a Gulf perspective, not at all. They're all in unison towards the same goal of trying to calm Iran, massage Iran in a way that doesn't undermine your security. But if I need to talk nicely to you and reopen an embassy, very good. You're most welcome. Even as I negotiate potential normalization with Israel, which obviously is not what Iran wants, even as I negotiate all kinds of things with the United States that no one says is anti-Iran, but is ultimately about protecting me from Iran. It's kind of like an improv game. In an improv game, you always say yes and.
Okay, that maybe is a good finish for this. This is the year of decision as far as we at ELNET are concerned. We find a Europe that's more understanding of Israel's situation at their governmental level. UK, Germany are into this full blown in all kinds of respects. We have a lot to do this year, and it doesn't get done by letters. It gets done by particular personal correspondence and taking people to Israel. We're going to need serious support to Friends of ELNET, as our European offices need as well from those citizens. I'll leave you with this. Without this happening, you wouldn't have had the strong European involvement and help in dealing with the current crisis. ELNET is a key organization for doing that because we're on the ground in the major capitals. Thank you very much for participating. It does require funds, and we have to keep that in mind. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was fascinating.
Thank you, Daniel. And thanks to everyone in ELNET for making this possible. Be well. Keep up the great work.